Welcome to Shamanic Voices, a podcast aimed at bringing our ancient indigenous Nordic wisdom traditions and perspectives, bringing these to bear on the challenges that we face in our modern world. I am your host, Georg, and we will often be joined by co-hosts and producers, Brian and Laurie. You can find our bi-monthly episodes on most major platforms, and if you enjoy this and like to read as well, please look up our blog with dozens of articles on health-related topics at www.teutonichealing.com. And now, let's get on with our show. Well, hello, everybody that's listening in. This is Shamanic Voices, and today we have a special guest. Laurie and I will be interviewing or just having a lively discussion with Bruce MacDonald of the Talamanca Review. And I encourage any of you to check out Talamanca Review. I get it on Spotify. I'm sure you can find them on most major podcasts or pretty much all the podcast capabilities. And he's also being, I guess you'd say syndicalized would be that'd be the right word, on one of Clyde Lewis's channels, right?
Yeah.
On Ground Zero Plus, correct?
That is correct. Yeah.
Excellent.
My three main platforms are Substack, YouTube, and Spotify. And Spotify is audio only if you want to just listen on earbuds on your phone.
Okay. Well, there you go, folks. That's what's what with that. And Bruce and I have always had some very lively discussions about all kinds of arcane and even exoteric matters. But I thought we might get back to a topic we've broached before, which could take hours, but we'll take what time we've got here. And that is the meaning of the West. We now find the West in a particularly precarious position, threatened by this Sino-Soviet, basically rehash of that era alliance and openly anti-Western initiatives like never before, and the very real possibility, which all these European states are talking about, of invading Europe. And I don't think they're all making it up. I mean, there are many, many, many statements by generals, statesmen, Lavrov, the foreign minister, stating their desire to take over Europe, to reconquer everything that was once in the USSR and keep on going. These statements have been made by all kinds of Kremlin spokesmen. Basically, if you're saying something in Russia, you are a Kremlin spokesman. There is no independent media whatsoever. So if we're that close to losing at least a large chunk of the West, and we certainly are threatened here too in the US by hostile invasions of the other type, disguised as humanitarian relief from unassimilable minorities, unassimilable, let's just say third world persons coming across the border with their hands out, looking for a handout, looking for a free ride, and 80% of them remaining on public assistance for the foreseeable future, for at least the first 5 years they're here. These are concerning. You can't have a viable society that way. So I leave it open where we go from here, but I'm afraid of what we lose. I think there are a lot of institutions unique to the West that humanity would be the worse off if we do lose. What say the two of you?
So my first question would be, we want to talk about politics? Because I have a journalism degree, I'm a political animal, but I just want to make sure you clearly understand the choice you're making.
I don't think it's politics. I think it's a matter of the course of civilization, which is a little bit larger than which party wins at the polls,
Yeah. So the first thing that I think about when reflecting on or digesting the litany of issues that you just gave is I go to intent. Is this an accidental contrivance of circumstance based on the fates and the destinies, as you two might know them through your theological system, and as most of us know them through the Greeks and various other systems? Or is this a hidden machination of some sort? Is this being done deliberately? and the people doing it know that it is going to do precisely what the critics of it are saying that it's going to do. Let's just start there and get a consensus amongst the three of us. I'll go first. I think it's clearly deliberate.
Yeah, I agree with you. What do you think, Laurie? You think all this is just happening by accident or it's been contrived?
Oh, I think it's more deliberate.
Yeah.
Well, when the West turns its back on the invasion of and occupation of Crimea in 2014, that gave a green light. But again, I think that was deliberate. Very,
Yeah.
very little response. That was definitely giving a green light for what happens 8 years later.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think this.
I certainly don't dispute the ambitions of Russia. I think that Putin is an old world monarchist. I think his mentality goes spiritually in terms of his imagination, goes right back to the czars.
Yep.
I think he skips right over the 20th century and looks at what he might regard as the romantic glory days of Russia. He may even, he's a history buff. He may even go all the way back to the Prussian Empire and dream of a day that, Germany and Russia are working together the way they used to in the past. A little story about that. So I grow abaca over here. I invested quite a bit of money. I started with 7 hectares I inherited from my father-in-law. It's a male banana plant used in the creation of a pulp for many things now. Tea bags, and envelopes, rope for ships. It's very sturdy, holds up to seawater over decades. And I expanded it to 14 hectares, having the hectares cleared and planted, which I paid for. And I was doing all of this because I'd entered into a contract with a German company called Galtfelter. And they went sort of belly up about 6 months after Nord Stream 2 got bombed. So, it's really interesting that I moved from Canada to Central America, and the effect of U.S. foreign policy has never hit me so directly as it did in the last 3 or 4 years with this Ukrainian war. Now, why did they strike the Nord Stream 2? Why did they penalize Germany? There's $1 million question.
There's a couple of different angles on that, Bruce, and I don't think anybody really knows. I think one interesting thing here is that Gazprom had a contract with Germany, which it was going to be unable to fulfill, a contract to produce a certain amount. And with some of the issues when the foreign technicians left the gas and oil fields, which they did in right after the invasion, a lot of the production shut down, at least it scaled way the heck back. So they were going to be unable to satisfy the contract, which would have meant a huge hole in the Russian hard currency exchange. So if you actually look at it on the map, which is something I don't think a lot of people really did, that's one of the most surveilled areas, one of the most, shall we say, sailed over and flown over areas in the Baltic, right there where that happened. And the closest place on land to it, if you wanted to go and say, take a submersible out there with some explosives and do the job, and some really good frogmen who are really well trained, say Soviet naval infantry types, their equivalent are SEALs. If you wanted to do that, Kaliningrad is where you would start, because that is the closest place to go to do it. And when you do that, you do a couple of things. First of all, you no longer owe anybody anything on the contract because, oops, somebody blew it up. Secondly, you provide the narrative when your own population may be saying, wait a minute, you said this would be over in 3 days, and there's actually resistance, and we're actually losing a lot of men and materiel. Oh, no, we're under attack. The West is attacking us. All we're doing is responding. See, we just got attacked. You're giving a rationale for a war that otherwise really can't be explained.
Yeah, possibly. Here's another scenario. Germany is epigenetically the consciousness of Europe in its totality through the 20th century. It was the only country divided after World War II. So you had half of it living within the MI6 and CIA world, and the other half living within the Stasi KGB world.
Yep,
And a lot of those old Stasi guys are still alive. I mean, the Cold War only ended in 93.
yep,
If you were midway through your career and 40 years old in 1993, you're still a relatively spry and capable person intellectually and diplomatically. 22 years later, you're only 62. That
true.
and I believe there was a tremendous fear that Germany and Russia would work this out as a result of that connective tissue. And in that working it out, there might be this epigenetic memory of the old Prussian Empire. And hey, this has worked out really well. Remember when we used to work together in the 1700s? And why don't we try this again? And that would have been the death of all the liberal democracies, like Spain, like France, like Portugal, like Britain. It would have just steamrolled them. It would have been the organizational and industrial might of Germany
And the raw
leverage.
materials of Russia. Yeah,
Yes, with the materials of Russia and leveraged into the East this time rather than into the West, because let's be honest, the only thing sustaining the economic union for the last 20 years was Germany. Everybody else was not meeting their bills, not meeting their interest payments, which is why they spanked Cyprus and
Greece,
Greece so
Greece. Yep.
hard in 2013, 2014. I think that principle of individual spiritual freedom and a consciousness connected will resurrect itself in another culture. I think it's a permanent part of the collective unconscious in humanity. You could say the West has represented it best, maybe the last 700 years.
Well, I'm trying to think where in anywhere else in the world we've had anything even similar to, well, I'll just use your term from the other night, the middleman representative government, because representative government means a middleman unless you're a village. You've got
Yeah.
somebody else going to speak for you somewhere else because the king can't see 10 million people. He can meet with an assembly, however.
Well, I think the root of personal liberty in the human record in this cycle of history is the Celts. Okay? The Celts were the first people to form a land registry, and all you had to do was report in with the local tribal chief once a year and say, "My fences are intact. I'm still using that land."
Yep.
And the registry would say 100 acres, McGregor. And all the interlinked clans would recognize that was your land. And the Scots were the only people that were never top heavy with government. They sort of independently, I should say the Celts. I shouldn't be so ethnically centric toward just the Scots. They were the only people that could organize in this way without heavy-handed pressure put upon them. And you would think that would be a weakness when engaging a force like highly organized and basically slave trained or entrained soldiers like the Roman legions and stuff like that. But I would remind you guys and all the listeners who are going to hear this, the only people ever to repel the Romans were the Celts. That's why they built Hadrian's Wall and emblazoned it with the message, civilization ends here. Do not, do not go beyond here. So this is what I'm saying. So if the Celts were a tribal people masquerading as a civilization, they were harmoniously interlinked tribal people. Second example I will give, both from my personal history. The first example of democracy in the world, and the idea of democracy was literally appropriated from these people, was the Iroquois Confederacy in northern United States and Canada, where the Ojibwa, the Mohawks, and these 12 or 13 tribes got together and said, "Look, we got to stop warring." And they formed a representative government that protected everybody's individual rights. So to think that so what I'm saying is the Western variant
Well,
of it, of
we
it we have now was stolen from other cultures. It
well, no,
doesn't it
we
doesn't
actually
come out of the Western Spiritus Mundi.
no, we actually did have representative government. The all thing in Iceland was first convened in, I think, the year 898, something like that.
Yeah, fair enough.
There was representative government in the
Yeah.
Mediterranean. There was still slavery, but there was representative government. There was also
Yeah, but when I say the modern age, I don't want to go back all the way back to the Hyperborean age. Clearly, they had representative government and individual liberty back then. The northern people were always civilized. I don't know what it is about the cold that brings civilization to people, but it does.
well, also it wasn't just the Celts that stopped the Romans. The Romans ran into a wall of steel when they tried to invade Germany multiple times. In fact, they got their rear ends handed to them a few times and kind
Yeah.
of decided not to try to do it again. They
Yeah.
also, according to some ancient legends, tried an abortive invasion of Denmark, the Danish coast, a couple of times. That didn't go too well either.
Yeah.
The blue-black beasts, as they described, the pine tar gleaming Roman galleys, just didn't have a whole lot of luck up on that shore any more than the Mongols had trying to invade Japan. It just
Yeah.
didn't work. But you had this idea, this loose confederation of local sovereigns making treaties with each other and having relative peace there and getting together in the all thing, which would be a collection of the petty kings. When we're speaking of kings, we're talking about something the size of a county today,
Yeah.
be considered a kingdom. That was the case throughout Scandinavia. It was not
Yeah.
an exceptional thing at all. And I'm glad the Iroquois later discovered it themselves. It was only noted, I think, in George Washington's journals back when he was a surveyor, before he ever became a military leader in the the British and the French and Indian Wars.
By the way, just to make my point I opened up with, that is actually a Gaelic word, survey, representing a land plot. It's taken right from the Gaelic and brought into
I can believe it.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So I think these are ideas that the West had, and we think of sometimes the advancements of these. Certainly in India, you had algebra, you had very advanced astronomy, that sort of thing, very advanced medicine and Ayurveda, but you also had a culture where, and you could actually visit the temple today, where, not the temple, but the palace, where one of the monarchs would just sit out on the corner of his palace overlooking the plaza with a bow and arrow and just practice his hunting skills by shooting commoners as they walked by. And there was no penalty for that whatsoever, no rebellion. That's just what happens. You happen to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. You get Big Daddy's arrow. Too bad. So, the idea of any kind of human rights whatsoever, anywhere else in the planet, women's rights, children's rights, these are completely Western ideas. You want to look
I'll give you that. Yeah, I'll give you that for sure.
Yeah, you want to look at the idea of setting land aside for nature, national parks. Well, you got to talk about the correspondence, which went on for a long time, between Theodore Roosevelt and Otto Bismarck. Great ideas. The idea of abolishing child labor. Again, look at the confluence of the two of them.
Yeah.
These are Western ideas. You lose the West, and there's nothing anywhere else that says that a child.
I'm not saying it's not looking pretty grim. I mean, I lived in Taiwan for 2 years. I speak rudimentary Mandarin, and if you dropped me in Beijing, I'd be fluent again in 4 to 6 weeks. But I would not want to live under Chinese governance.
Hell no.
It is brutal, absolutely brutal. Yeah, Laurie, what's on your mind? Are you a student or a practitioner of Teutonic shamanism?
I am doing my best to learn.
Yeah, it's a fascinating study, eh?
Well, you could talk about some of your own experiences if you want to, Laurie. It's entirely up to you.
Lately, I've been noticing things about group dynamics, how groups of people work together, and small groups and large groups and different groups I've been to seem to have the same patterns of behavior. You have people in the group who are there to see what they can get out of it, and they have a tendency to kind of dominate. And then you have other people in the group who are there to give, and you have very few people who are really well balanced in the middle. and somehow the people who
Yeah.
were somehow leaders have to balance out what I call the needy versus the greedy, and the givers before things kind of blow up.
Yeah. I totally agree. I mean, group dynamics are a fascinating topic for me these days. You know, I married into a large Latin family. My wife has 10 brothers and sisters. I don't even have, I couldn't give you an accurate count of the number of nieces and nephews, somewhere between 30 and 40. And then you're getting into the hundreds when you spread out into the first cousins, because each of the elders, my deceased father-in-law and my living mother-in-law, they each came from families of 11 children. So it's 11, 11, 11. And there's always something going on. And this is one of my favorite topics these days to bitch about, because being the gringo, I always get like asked for money for emergencies. And if it's a literal emergency, I always help if it's related to a prescription or something. But I've been studying the group dynamics of this family, and how it works, and whose perspective wins. And it's never the right perspective, and it's never the sane perspective, and it's never the corrective perspective that resolves the immediate emergency and sets in motion a new way of doing things, a new way of behaving, which will guarantee the problem never resurfaces. And it's extremely frustrating for me, because I say, okay, well, this is going to recur again in another 3 months. Like for, like some of the brothers-in-law, if they get divorced, they immediately get into a new marriage, and there's not a lot of money over here. You can't support two families, and they fall behind on their child support, and they dodge the police for a few months. But if they finally get pinched, you gotta help out with the child support. And you think, well, how is this gonna, I don't think he should be in a new family. He should be maybe concentrate on the 3 kids he already has and live single for a while, or find just a girlfriend on the side. But they don't listen to reason.
Well, you see, you're talking about finding structural solutions, Bruce. That's a very
Yeah.
Western idea.
Yeah,
And
it
you
is.
just don't just react. You find a codified solution that says, well, I did this, so now I need to change and do that. And what
Yeah.
Laurie's speaking of is kind of the group dynamics within a church, where she was chief cook and bottle washer and doing everything and getting no appreciation whatsoever for it, no love. Just, oh, she's doing this. Well, let's give her this as well. Let's give her that as well. Right?
Yeah, I guess I would relate the issues at church with what Bruce was just talking about. How do you know when you're helping versus enabling the
There it
problem?
is. There it is. And enabling is a kind of causal seepage, a little bit of their transgression or their disfrequency with reality seeps into yours. And if you're sensitive, and I'm sensitive, and I'm sure you're sensitive as well, um, you see the effects, and you go, man, I let that happen. I never should have done this. But it's very hard to stand up to the group, right? If you're kind of like the only one seeing your perspective, because in te in telling them the truth, there is a little bit, you have to shame them a little bit. And if you're dealing with church elders, and I'm dealing with family members, including my mother-in-law, who doesn't want to see one of her adult children be incarcerated for 6 months for non-payment of child support, it's very difficult to have a group meeting and say, well, here's the problem, and I don't know how we actually solve this problem. Um,
There's a big difference too between being in a family with the obligations that occurs, having married into it, and in a voluntary association like a church, where you can say, hey, look, I'm not doing this anymore. Let somebody else volunteer into it,
Yeah, the what Bruce is talking about is really the same dynamic that I just went through with the church. I started saying 6 months ago, I was the treasurer. Here's the problem. And, I expressed the problem to the board and they said, that's not a problem. I said, it's a problem because this is what's going to happen next and it's not going to be good. And then it almost seemed like the bad thing that I said was going to happen next, just everybody jumped on it. And they were almost like saying, let's make it happen.
Yeah.
Because, I was saying, well, we, for the first time ever, we have money in savings. We
Yeah.
should do something with this to earmark it to make sure that somebody doesn't come along and try to see how they can get their hands on it, because we've had a history of embezzling. Well, what happens? But everyone starts saying, I'm going to get my hands on it, and they find some kind of backdoor way to do that. And I said, no. Then they start, spreading their little rumors and whatever. And I'm not married to this church. So eventually it got to a point where I was harassed. And I just said, if you won't let me speak at a board meeting, I'll speak in an email. And I called out the people who were spreading lies about me in a group email and ended the group email by saying, I'm stepping away. and so I stepped away, and there's been this kind of domino effect that is not good. And I don't know where it's going to go from here, but at this point, it looks like there's going to be a lot of work for the few people who are left to do anything constructive with it. And well, another side note of it is that they couldn't find anyone to take over the spot of treasurer, so they have hired me to be their bookkeeper. So I said, notice now that you are paying me to do a small fraction of what I used to do for free. Think about your next steps very carefully.
Does that make you legally liable if embezzlement occurs?
I'm the bookkeeper and there is no treasurer, so I don't know. I mean, I can only build a spreadsheet based on the information they give me. So, I don't know how. I would make embezzling very difficult, because if I see anything that's unusual, I'll put it in my monthly treasury report to the board and just call it like I see it and say, hey, big red bold letters, what happened here? And there are people who are very angry right now, and they're retaliating in childish ways. So
Those were people who would have a class at her church or whatever, and then pocket half the money, give the church the other half. And what was one of the guys actually would throw away checks made out to the church, right?
Yeah. One person who was has always been seen as a key leader in the church. They have classes at the church. People pay for the class, and you're supposed to. And for the past 4 or 5 years, you're supposed to turn in all the money to the treasurer, and then the treasurer will write a check to pay the teacher. Well, this particular teacher just takes it all home and won't fill out the form for attendance. And he's been known to take home checks that people have written to the church, and when he can't cash them, he just throws them in the trash. And now he's the person who is complaining that teachers aren't being paid. And so I pointed out just this morning in the April Treasury report, and it's like, you know what? He took home the money last month, so no, I'm not going to write him another check. And he's still mad. Paid.
I can't even begin to tell you how cathartic this is for me hearing this. I thought I was the only person dealing with this kind of nonsense in my little mountain pueblo with campesinos and Nicaraguans and Quebecar natives. And I thought that is amazing. It's very cathartic. I actually feel very good right now. Not because of the misery you're going through, but just because I think, oh man, this is kind of like a universal human nature,
Yes, I was the treasurer of a Boy Scout troop 15 years ago, I guess. Has it been that long? And the same kinds of things happen there. And when I first became the treasurer of the Boy Scout troop, very quickly, I noticed embezzling. And the first thing I did is comb through the books, and I saw that the previous treasurer kept some very bad records. I reported it to the board and said, every time there's a major event, the treasurer writes a $300 check to her best friend, and they go shopping. If you look at the books, well, they had treasury reports with bogus numbers, and nobody really looked at it, which enabled the problem. Well, then everyone got mad at me. Half the people who admired me for it, the other half the people got mad at me for running off the people who were volunteering. And so when I became treasurer of this church, I said, here's what happened last time. It's going to happen again. I'm going to comb through the books to see how this organization works. And when I find problems, I'm going to report it, which I did. And it turned out the embezzling was probably 10 times worse than anyone expected. And so I was treasurer for 18 months at the church. And in that amount of time, I can't remember the exact numbers, but for the first time ever, this church is gaining about $10,000 a year. And that's a lot of money for this church that has a $30,000 a year budget. So it's like, so about a third of your donations are being embezzled away. And so we don't need to have all these fundraisers if you just put an end to the embezzlement. And
I would postulate here, and I may be going way out on a limb, that the US used to be a society where that kind of thing was very rare, where honesty really did prevail in transactions. And I'll tell you what I think changed it. That would be Roosevelt's New Deal, the advent of socialism, the idea of something for nothing. Now, it took a while to creep in. The US Communist Party literally called, years later, after the Chinese communists did their long march, called it the Long March Through Our Institutions, where they were putting people in to become professors of education and so on, to warp minds for decades to come and write textbooks with anti-Western, anti-American concepts in them. But I think that back when a man's word was his bond, when there was no such thing as a free lunch, Robert Heinlein, of course, said that, and The Moon is a Harsh Mistress. I'm sure you've read him. I could see the smile. I could tell, another Heinlein fan. But, but I think that there was a time when we didn't believe in something for nothing.
Yeah.
And I think all the sweepstakes, all the coupons, all the other stuff, which implies there's something for nothing. And certainly the emergence of what I will just call the welfare state. And I'm not saying
Yeah.
that there aren't some occasions when it's justified, but a whole lot of the time it really isn't. It's just somebody deciding they want to have their life and someone else pays for it.
Yeah.
so you
I
feel
think
like
that's what's-
Roosevelt's New Deal instilled a sense of entitlement in people.
I think it's corrupted
100%.
the national
100%.
character.
100%, and they exacerbated it tremendously in the early 70s by amplifying it and simultaneously going off the gold standard, which gave them license to do it, which brought us to the fiscal crisis we're in now. It's the church story you told applied to your nation
big level. Yeah.
over 53 years.
I think you can actually go back to the Federal Reserve Act of 1913, just talking about the U.S., but the U.S. wasn't the first country to have a consortium of banks basically running the Treasury. The Chancellor of the Exchequer in Great Britain, I'm sure there's an equivalent institution in Canada that does the same damn thing.
Yeah, Governor of the Bank of Canada.
See, and
now our Prime Minister, by the way.
Oh, wonderful guy.
Yeah, I think it's the first time in a G7 country ever that a former central bank head became head of state. You never want that. You never want the head of intelligence, CIA, KGB,
No, definitely not.
And you never want the head of banking. You want to get somebody from the world, right? But here we go again. What do you make of shamanism and what you're learning with Greg?
It's a lot to learn. I'm just spending most of my time just trying to wrap my mind around it. I'm a parts to whole thinker, so I have to get all the pixels together before I can see the picture.
Yeah.
So I'm still trying to gather pixels on that.
Unlike a religion, it's very phenomenological. It'll start in your dreams and it'll just start to work into your life. And it's a much more experienced spiritual outlook than just a belief system in a church or something. Don't you agree?
Yeah, well, even for me, a belief system in a church is another parts the whole thing, because even as a child, my mother used to drag me kicking and screaming to the Methodist church, and I was the kid who kept asking all those inconvenient questions, and my mother and my Sunday school teachers would say, just believe it. And I always had to say, why? And I got in trouble a lot. So
yeah, that was like me with my Catholic upbringing.
Yeah, I was Catholic for 25 years too, and that was my adult 25 years, and I asked a lot of questions there, but I passed that beautiful attitude onto my children who took that to
So
Catholic school.
I'll tell you a story. Like, so in Canada, we also have a Catholic school system, which is funded by the public treasury. So you can go private school, we call them public, or you can go into the Catholic system. You can hardly tell the difference. The kids are the same. They all, do whatever, use their phones and smoke weed and do whatever teenagers do. But it is a Catholic education, and it goes right from grade 1 to the end of, and a lot of the Muslim and Jewish parents put their kids into the Catholic system as well because they'd rather have a religious education than. And in I think it was the seventh grade, they had to bring the archbishop in. Now, an archbishop is really the same status as a cardinal, but not yet appointed a cardinal. A cardinal is an archbishop appointed to the cardinal of colleges. They had to bring
Oh, okay.
the archbishop into my grade 7 religion class because nobody in the school could answer my question. Here's my question. Okay, so this guy resurrects. Look, and I would read right from the Bible. I said, look, nobody's recognizing him by sight. What's going on here? Is he in the same body? And it went right up the flagpole. They brought the archbishop in, and he did. And then when he left after his 45 minutes of nonsense, my religion teacher, great guy, I think he's passed now. His name was Terry Flynn, Irish guy. He looks at the whole class. He goes, I'll be the first to say that was an inappropriate answer for a grade 7 class. And he weaseled out of Bruce's question.
Weaseled out. Wow.
Yeah.
Gee.
Yeah. I mean, he just gave something you'd tell 50-year Jesuit seminaries or something, right? Some transubstantiation mystery and real Catholic esoterica. And we're all there. Well, how old are you in grade 12? 13? We're all looking at this guy like, speak English, buddy. Either you can answer the question or you can't. And he couldn't.
Yeah, well, that's the answer is always the same, Bruce. You see, you have to take it on faith.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm not big on faith.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
kind of the standard Catholic answer to things, to say, well, that's one of the mysteries.
Yeah.
My
I
children
think
didn't accept mystery as an answer.
take it on faith, please. Take it on faith.
Well, Laurie,
Um,
you could perhaps share some of what you've seen as far as the practical side of it, what we do in the, because we are, first of all, priests or priestesses, and only secondly, are we healers. So it's actually faith healing. So you've certainly seen a lot of people come and go through our clinics.
Yeah, I think the first thing I notice with the Teutonic healing is that we have to have a moral standard. If you don't live with high moral standards, the gods and goddesses are not going to connect with you. You can ask all you want to, but
yeah.
you're just going to kind of get ignored. It's like, oh, sorry, not compatible with that frequency.
Yeah.
So I think that has to come first.
What is morality? Now that we've talked about Methodism, Catholicism, and Teutonic shaman, what is morality? The morality that brings in the Teutonic gods.
Well, I think first, it has to be, you have to put the greater good ahead of yourself.
Boom. Yeah.
And
I totally
secondly,
agree.
you have to keep your word.
Yeah.
And thirdly, you never harm others unless you absolutely have to in self-defense. You never harm others for your own profit or benefit.
Certainly the gods have abandoned corporate North America.
Yeah. Well, I think corporate North America abandoned most kinds of theology, except the type that says the left hand knoweth not what the right hand doeth when it's under the covers or in the wallet of somebody else or wherever else it is, or picking the safe of somebody else.
Yeah. Yeah.
Whatever that referred to.
Yeah.
I have another question about our group dynamics. You're talking earlier about Roosevelt's New Deal and how that we talked about how that brought about a sense of entitlement, but how would you balance that out with not wanting the ultra rich to control everything and taking advantage of people who are living in poverty?
Well, I would say you would have to have some sort of collective way of rationing the excess wealth to ensure that there is something for the public good. Because after all, if let's say that I own a trucking company, or I own a transit company, or I own a food production company, I'm using a lot of your utilities that everybody else is using. I'm probably getting it for pennies on the dollar from what you as a homeowner pay for it. So to some extent, with the rates that are given to industry, there's already a public subsidy in existence.
Yeah.
So it's only fair to take some of those profits, some of what that individual earns, what that board earns, or whatever, and plow it back into the public good. I'm using the roads and beating the hell out of them with these big heavy trucks rumbling down the road with my cans of soup or whatever I'm making. Whereas you, as the homeowner driving your SUV, are doing almost nothing to the roads. You see, there are a lot of ways in which I'm using many more resources than you are, and the public is subsidizing me. So it's only fair that some of that go back to the public.
Mm-hmm.
I just look at it as a swap around, a turnaround. And of course, you have to curb avarice. The problem with free enterprise is maintaining free enterprise. You have to have a certain amount. It's going to sound like a contradiction. You have to have a certain amount of regulation in order to have free enterprise, because otherwise you end up with oligopolies or monopolies, and you end up with collusion and price fixing and lowering of standards, et cetera. So you have to have a built-in system of safeguards to ensure that competition remains vibrant and strong, which is in the interest of everybody. It's the interest of innovation. It's the interest of the public welfare, as far as not paying excessive prices when you have a monopoly. We had a monopoly in this country for years and years and years through what we used to call Ma Bell, the Bell telephone company. There was no competition, so they could charge you whatever they wanted. A long distance call was ridiculously expensive. It cost them almost nothing to do it. So we basically had a large public subsidy through supporting that monopoly. And finally, some people challenged it in court, and we had the breakup and the coming of these competing telephone companies, where it's much less expensive to use we think nothing about a long distance call anymore.
Yeah, I think the level of organized and, quite frankly, generational corruption in Canada and the United States now has reached a point where it makes a mockery of the Boston Tea Party. You've almost become worse than the original model you rebelled against.
Oh, so I agree, and I think the British Crown had far fewer requirements of the average citizen, and certainly of the average businessman. Good heavens, if you're an independent businessman, the amount of hoops, the number of hoops you have to jump through and over for the US government is way more than what you ever had to do for the Crown.
Yeah. So I think the answer to your question lies right in the fairness of the system, at the living heart of it, which is the money, which is the Federal Reserve, which never should have been put into private hands. It should have been handled by Treasury. Canada never should have let go of the governmental control of the Bank of Canada in the 70s, which was done by the father of the moron who just nearly destroyed the country, Justin Trudeau, his father, Pierre Trudeau, in the 70s. And this is why you can see the interlinking and intentionality of it all. When you go back to what I said earlier about what Nixon did with the gold standard and a few other things, you see the world we're living in now. It was planned. And a lot of people have difficulty comprehending that because they can't comprehend large range planning. Because although they can comprehend the evil of individual people, Saddam Hussein, Pol Pot, Adolf Hitler, Stalin, and on and on and on, they see that as a deformed person. Kim Jong-un would be an example in modern times for sure.
But the idea of collective evil, where a group of evil men get together and scheme together.
Where it passes from generation to generation. It's actually, when you look at the history of civilized countries, and civilized means they can get organized enough to build roads, underground sewage, and maintain a modicum of some standard of living. The familial institutionalization of corruption is the norm, not the exception. And it needs to be fought about every 7 generations. I think Jefferson even said it. He said, look, this isn't the only revolution we're going to fight. You're going to be fighting these revolutions all the time.
Well,
Because
Thomas Jefferson said
yeah,
that the tree of liberty had to be watered with the blood of patriots,
yeah,
ongoing and tyrants. And was assuming that there would be a clash that would
yeah,
happen generationally. And I think he was absolutely correct.
on 100%. Yeah, 100%.
So
So
there's this, and I don't really know how you stop that, how you have the collective that remains high-minded and based on principles rather than greed and rather than collusion and the welfare of an elite few rather than the many.
yeah, yeah. But I don't know. They're very open about it now. I believe we're in an organized depopulation event. I believe it started. They started to broadcast it. I'd say 9/11 was the beginning. That's when we had the big change from the old world to the new world they're moving into. And it's just been a steady progression since then. 2008 and the subprime mortgage fiasco. How can individual taxpayers spend 4, 5, 6, 7 years in prison, albeit minimum security, for IRS cases in the United States, and nobody in multiple regulatory bodies knew that these mortgage bonds were not AAA. In fact, they were negative AAA. They were complete junk. That was
Now,
done intentionally.
at
It's
this
all done
point, do I
intentionally.
get to say that you're talking politics, Bruce?
Yeah, sorry.
No, it's okay. I'm
You
just kidding.
started it. You
I'm
started
just
it.
kidding. I'm just kidding.
I do recall giving a warning at the beginning of the podcast.
No, you see, these things are interconnected. My point, I'm saying it humorously because you can't really draw a line between the two.
No,
They
no,
are
you can't.
unfortunately right there. And I think the most interesting thing I've heard in the last week or two, you've probably caught it also, Bruce, is the idea that the 21 trillion missing dollars that Catherine Austin Fitts, great
Yeah.
crusader, has identified, and nobody's arguing with it, by the way. Her audit was absolutely spot on. Actually went into building, guess what?
Underground cities?
cities.
Yeah.
Lots of them. So
Yeah.
somebody's getting away from whatever the rest of us are going to be getting into on the surface.
I hear they got free HBO Max down there.
I bet they do.
No Disney though. No Disney.
Yeah, really? Okay, too bad. I'm sure they've got whatever entertainments they want. No
Yeah,
kidding.
I think there's a group of these psychopaths on the planet who actually think they could survive a nuclear war and come up in 70, 90 years or whatever. And I also think they have much more remediation technology to alleviate heavy radiation in
Yeah.
probably under 5 years now.
There's a very interesting UFO theory I've heard, and it might ring a bell with either of you too, that the Greys actually are not us in the future. They are the remnants, the underground, the people who went underground, got sealed off, ended up living on almost nothing after a while. Their food intake got almost really minimal. Their need for a physical body, because everything was automated down there, this paradise is set up for themselves, and only emerge many, many thousands of years later. And they're in this deformed state.
It may be there are many gray races. That may be one of them, but the deformed gray that we see on Earth that you're talking about is some kind of organic Frankenstein creation, I think, that happened on this Earth. And I know that because of Stardust Ranch and the work of Dr. Levengood, the botanist. Their organic system is not based on blood and hemoglobin, it's based on chlorophyll. They're closer to being plants than they are to being mammals.
Well, I know that Levengood was somebody that everybody gave their abduction samples to, just like Dr. Roger Lear, to see what was, what was involved in an implant or whatever. He was one of the few people that did really good research on it and gave feedback. He was in collaboration with Linda Moulton Howe and many other researchers for a long time. Passed away, I don't remember when, several years ago.
Around 2012,
Yeah,
right when I was supposed to get his conclusions on the gray corpse that John Edmonds killed in Stardust Ranch, and then his wife died a week later.
Oh, can't be a coincidence.
and then I bailed on the book.
I wonder if our current corporatocracy, bankster corporatocracy, et cetera, is actually run by the extraterrestrials, the Greys, the reptilians, or if
Yeah.
this is purely organic human. It just
No.
seems too organized for what we're capable of.
No, yeah, it goes into space. It absolutely does. And the crypto will go even more so into space. That many people are saying in certain circles that the truth of crypto is it's the commencement of intergalactic trade.
Okay, can you explain that for our listeners? Like, I'm going to do a transaction with my Bitcoin wallet. How is this benefiting somebody on planet Zebulon or whatever?
Yeah, I can't explain it to you. I don't know. I don't really understand it. Even the present financial system is connected to the space program as well. I heard that the space banker, the contadore, as they say in Spanish, the accountant, is actually or was actually Warren Buffett, right?
Wow.
Yeah. Yeah, I was told that by the guy I wrote the Galactic Historian book with.
Is
And
it
he's just,
possible that having all of this focus on finance keeps everyone's energetic vibration low because they're so worried about money?
yeah.
Absolutely.
And then the
So
Greys
I,
are just feeding
so
on
in, so in 2014, I moved to the rainforest, 7.5 kilometers up a dirt road, and I've now commenced a massive food project. I want to be completely autonomous and not really need money. I'll continue to work, but not really need money that much in the future. You know, I've got a 2 acre food project planned, like yucca, corn. I'm a vegetarian too, although I do eat meat 3, 4 times a year. But basically a vegetarian. And I've been buying a lot of food over here, and I buy it off my neighbors. We make our own cheese here. You get milk right out of the cow, unpasteurized. But I really, really want to consolidate my food system now because I think it's just going to get harder and harder and harder every day, every week, every month going forward to about 2030, 2035, maybe as far out as 2040. I don't know. And I'm not trying to scare you if you live in the United States, but the more organized the supply chain, the more vulnerable the people are going to be in the future that's coming. And that's all been
I
that's all
actually published a blog article on exactly what you're talking about, called "The
yeah.
Real Hunger Games," going into how all of these food storage and food processing plants mysteriously caught fire or
Yeah.
got bombed, or they just had bad luck. Meteors fell from the sky on them, whatever, rains of frogs, just all
There's a
kinds of stuff
guy
happened.
there's a guy who maintains a website that you can go to, and he basically integrates it with Google Maps, and he's got little red pins on all the places where there's been a food supply
I've
aberration.
seen that.
It's in the thousands.
Yeah, it is.
It's and and if you go back and you compare it from 2000 to 2010, it's jumped. Food processing accidents have jumped about 10,000%.
So who is this? Has to be a group of very advanced, highly trained saboteurs, special operator types on the ground doing this stuff. Are they doing the same thing in Canada or not?
Yeah, they are. Yeah.
So who do you think it is?
I don't know, I don't get too lost in the details. I find when that happens, you start to lose the spiritual focus in your life. I think spiritually, you have the right to know what's going on to plan best for your own individual future. But I think when you get down to the level of details, names, organizations, how they're doing it, unless you're being paid to do that by a competent authority, a legitimate authority, I wouldn't go too deep into that. It's an easy way to get killed too.
Well, to me, it's just a matter of being a well-informed citizen and knowing what decisions to make. Like as a collective, if you're writing your congressman, if you actually have the ear of somebody who in representative government, being able to say,
Yeah,
like if it's being sponsored by the Mossad, you might want to boycott Israel. If it's being sponsored by
yeah.
North Korea, you might want to do whatever additional sanctions. We don't know who's behind it. That's what I'm saying. I
Well,
think it's a legitimate question.
the destruction of Rome is a goal of the Sanhedrin. It's in their scripture, it's in their prophecies, and modern Rome is England and the United States are the two centers of it now. So yeah, there's so whatever force is behind the Sanhedrin is probably the force behind this in general. without naming names or anything, right?
Well, the Sanhedrin, yep, they would be the,
And when I say Sanhedrin, I just mean as the head of the let's say the World Jewish Congress. The Sanhedrin is the established legal authority in the Jewish world, right? So they'd be giving orders and judgments. They're the judges.
now,
And
are they the judges for both Orthodox and Reformed and all of the
every
different sects?
nobody contests the authority of the Sanhedrin.
Okay.
Nobody. Yeah. Nobody. The I imagine the contesting of it is fought out in an internal electoral process about who gets to it. Right. So if Abad Lubavitch wants to stack the Sanhedrin court with followers in their sect, they'll do heavy lobbying in the Jewish world. But once the Sanhedrin is set, it's set. It's like the Supreme Court of the United States.
I see. Okay, interesting. So
Yeah.
operatives directed by the Sanhedrin. Okay.
Well, philosophically, I'd say that's it's the only public narrative out there that's coming true. Rome will fall, and Rome is falling now. We're watching it. We've all tacitly agreed in this podcast that it's being done intentionally.
Yeah.
So it's just grade 8 math at this point, right?
Well, Rome fell, but the Appian Peninsula continued to exist and transform into what we today have as modern Italy
Yeah.
and all the other states.
Yep.
So
100%. Yeah.
just had the
100%.
loss of the governmental form and the institutions and so on.
Yeah. 100%.
Well, any last thoughts anybody has?
It's always a blessing to be alive. Although we talked about some concerning things today, don't let it interrupt your gratitude for being alive.
No, you don't. I agree. And wherever you are,
it's always good to get a body.
Well, there's no magical places on earth. I sat on my front porch and we had abundant rain the last couple of weeks and just meditated with the lights out, just hearing the thunder and enjoying the light show and seeing the sheets of rain coming down and breathing the negative ions. Nobody can take that away from me. I don't have to be in Zanzibar to experience that. The spiritual life is available to anybody. Thank you for joining us on this episode of Shamanic Voices. Please like and subscribe so that you won't miss our coming episode, where we always try to have engaging and interesting topics and or guests. Thank you, and go with the gods.